March 3rd, 1994, 7:14 a.m., Alexandria, Virginia. North Courthouse Road, Apartment 1, 102. The morning is the color of old pewter, a mid-Atlantic winter that hasn't decided whether to end. The temperature sitting at -4 Celsius. A wind off the Potomac cutting through the bare oak trees along the street with the kind of persistence that makes commuters walk with their chins tucked into their collars, eyes down, seeing nothing. The kind of morning that discourages attention. At 7:14, the parking lot of the Rotunda condominium complex is performing its ordinary morning choreography. Cars warming up, exhaust making small white clouds in the frozen air. A woman in a dark coat walking a terrier along the cleared sidewalk. A postal truck idling at the corner. The postal truck has been there since 6:50 a.m. It has not moved. Inside apartment 1, 102, a man is getting dressed. He is 51 years old, heavy-set, with a broad Slavic face that he has spent 2 decades teaching to carry an expression of faint American distraction. The particular look of a man whose mind is on the commute ahead, on the meeting scheduled for 9 a.m., on nothing of consequence. He wears a gray suit, white shirt, a tie with a small geometric pattern. He is meticulous about his appearance, always has been. His shoes are polished to a standard that his colleagues at the FBI have occasionally, affectionately, teased him about. His name is Robert Philip Hanssen. He has been a special agent of the Federal Bureau of Investigation since 1976. He holds the highest security clearances the United States government issues. He knows the names of every Soviet intelligence officer the FBI has identified operating in the United States. He knows the technical capabilities of American signals intelligence. He knows the identities of human sources, agents, informants, recruited officers, that the CIA has spent years and millions of dollars cultivating inside Soviet and Russian intelligence. He has been selling all of it to Moscow for 22 years. This morning, he's going to make one more dead drop, one more package, left at a prearranged location in a Northern Virginia park, to be collected by SVR officers who still, after more than 2 decades of this arrangement, have never met him face to face, do not know his real name, and have referred to him in their files, variously as Ramon, as B, and most recently, in the operational shorthand of the post-Soviet SVR, simply as the source. The postal truck in the parking lot is not a postal truck. The FBI agents inside it have been waiting since 6:50 a.m., and they are watching apartment 1, 102, with a concentration that is almost physical in its intensity. One of them, a senior counterintelligence supervisor, is holding a photograph. The photograph shows a man in a gray suit leaving a Northern Virginia park in December 1993, shot from a distance with a long lens, the image slightly soft at the edges. The man in the photograph and the man currently selecting his briefcase in apartment 1, 102 are the same person. The supervisor checks his watch. In the counterintelligence division of the FBI, watching has been the operative verb for a very long time. They have been watching without seeing. That is the precise, terrible nature of what has happened. They were watching a traitor every working day for 22 years, and they did not see him. The temperature is -4. The oak trees hold their bare arms against the gray sky. Robert Hanssen picks up his briefcase and moves toward the door. The clock has reached 0. The official story of Robert Hanssen, as it existed on March 2nd, 1994, the day before his arrest, was the story of a 25-year career in federal law enforcement that was, but by the Bureau's own assessment, distinguished. Hanssen had joined the Chicago Police Department in 1972, moved to the FBI in 1976, and built a specialty in counterintelligence that was considered genuinely valuable. He was difficult, certainly. Colleagues found him arrogant, prickly, prone to a cutting sarcasm that left junior agents dreading his review of their work. Yet he was intensely religious, a devout convert to Opus Dei Catholicism, whose faith was no private matter but a visible framework around which he organized his public identity. He was not popular. He was respected, in the specific FBI sense of that word. His analysis was sharp. His technical knowledge was deep. His security consciousness. His insistence on proper classification procedures, on information compartmentalization, and on the rigorous application of counterintelligence principles was almost aggressive in its thoroughness. This was the man the FBI knew. This was the man whose security clearances were renewed on schedule, whose access to the most sensitive programs in American intelligence was never seriously questioned across 2.5 decades. What both sides believed, in their different ways, that during the long middle years of the Hanssen operation, roughly 1979 to 1991, and then again from 1985 to 2001, was a version of events shaped by the information Hanssen himself provided and controlled. Moscow believed it had an extraordinary source, a man of access and reliability unprecedented in the SVR's experience with American penetrations. Washington believed, when it believed anything coherent at all, which was not consistently, that its security infrastructure was holding, that the losses it was experiencing were attributable to other causes, that the damage assessments it occasionally undertook were complete. Neither belief was accurate. The reality was something that neither system was architecturally designed to perceive. The geopolitical stakes across the Hanssen operational period covered one of the most consequential spans in 20th century history. His first contact with Soviet intelligence came in 1979. At the height of a renewed Cold War tension following the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, his most damaging material was passed in the mid to late 1980s as the Reagan administration was pursuing its Strategic Defense Initiative and conducting an aggressive covert offensive against Soviet interests globally. He continued operating through the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, paused briefly, and resumed with the SVR, the new Russian Foreign Intelligence Service, in 1985, remaining active until the morning of his arrest in 2001. The arc of his betrayal tracks the arc of the Cold War and its aftermath almost precisely. The key players in this story occupy positions that, when placed against each other, reveal the operational geometry of the entire affair. Robert Hanssen himself, born April 18, 1944, in Chicago, the son of a Chicago police officer whose relationship with his son was, by all accounts, including Hanssen's own, defined by contempt. And Howard Hanssen considered his son weak, unimpressive, unlikely to amount to anything of significance. The psychological weight of this assessment, never fully shed, runs as a subterranean current through everything that follows. Hanssen was a man who possessed, genuinely, an exceptional mind, and who spent his career in an institution that never fully recognized it, which was something he could not forgive. Viktor Cherkashin, the KGB's counterintelligence chief at the Soviet embassy in Washington during the critical early period, the man who received Hanssen's first contact letter and recognized immediately what it represented. Cherkashin was a professional of the first order, and his memoir, Spy Handler 2005, provides the most detailed Russian side account of the Hanssen operation available. His assessment of Hanssen, rendered in retrospect with the economy of a man who has spent his career evaluating human intelligence sources, was simple. He was the most important agent the KGB ever had. Aldrich Rick Ames, the CIA counterintelligence officer who began passing information to the KGB in 1985, whose betrayal ran parallel to Hanssen's for years, whose 1994 arrest convinced the intelligence community that the source of a devastating series of intelligence losses had been found and contained. Ames became, in ways he never knew, Hanssen's most valuable protection. Every time a Soviet asset was exposed and killed, the internal investigation found Ames. The damage accounting stopped there. Nobody looked further. Roderick "Rod" Ramsey, the FBI supervisory special agent who led the eventual investigation that identified Hanssen, does not feature prominently in the public narrative because his work was, by the nature of counterintelligence success, invisible until the moment of arrest. And he appears here as a reminder that the apparatus of discovery, when it finally functioned, was built by people who proceeded methodically and without drama through an archive of failure. The symbolic object in Hanssen's story is a black garbage bag, specifically the kind he used for his dead drops. The ordinary 30-gallon contractor bags available at any hardware store, and in which he placed his packages of classified material, and which he left at designated sites in the parks and quiet suburban locations of Northern Virginia. He chose garbage bags deliberately. They were weatherproof, anonymous, and carried a studied contempt for tradecraft ceremony. No hollowed-out trees or chalk marks for Hanssen. The black garbage bag was the aesthetic of a man who considered himself too intelligent for the theater of espionage, but who wanted the transaction to be exactly what it was: a delivery made by a man who had decided the recipient deserved what was inside more than the institution that had generated it. The bag appears throughout this story. It will appear again. What was actually happening inside the FBI while Robert Hanssen moved through his career, what the institution could not see because of how it was structured to see, requires understanding the specific architecture of American counterintelligence in the 1970s and 1980s, and the ways in which that architecture, designed against certain threats, created predictable blind spots. The FBI's counterintelligence division operated, in this period, on a case-driven model. So you identified a threat, a Soviet intelligence officer, a known or suspected agent, and you built a case around that threat. The model was prosecutorial in its logic. You gathered evidence, you established facts, you moved toward a courtroom. This was not simply bureaucratic convention. It reflected a deep institutional DNA. The FBI was, at its core, a law enforcement organization, and law enforcement organizations move from crime to suspect, not from anomaly to investigation. Counterintelligence, done properly, requires the opposite movement. You begin with anomaly. You ask why an asset has gone silent, why a program has been compromised, why the Soviets seem to know something they should not know. You work backward from the damage to its source. This is a methodology that requires tolerating ambiguity for extended periods, following threads that may lead nowhere, and, most critically, being willing to direct suspicion at your own institution. The FBI is structurally and culturally found this enormously difficult. Hanssen's first contact with the KGB in November 1979 was not a walk-in to a Soviet facility. It was a letter mailed to the residential address of a KGB officer named Dmitry Polyakov. And here is where the story acquires one of its sharpest and most painful edges, because Dmitry Polyakov was himself a CIA and FBI asset, one of the most valuable human sources in the history of American intelligence, a Soviet military intelligence officer who had been passing information to the West for nearly 2 decades. Hanssen knew this. He included Polyakov's identity in his first letter, partly as proof of his access and bona fides, and partly, this is the interpretation that intelligence historians have returned to repeatedly, because it is consistent with everything else known about Hanssen's psychology, as an act of deliberate institutional violence. He was demonstrating, to Moscow and to himself, that he could burn the most protected asset in American intelligence in his opening move. Polyakov was arrested by the KGB in 1986. He was executed in 1988. Hanssen's first operational period ran from 1979 to 1981, during which he passed material of significant value and then, for reasons that have never been fully explained, stopped. The KGB's file on this period, partially reconstructed from Russian sources after 2001, then indicates that Moscow was dismayed by the interruption and uncertain whether the source had been compromised or had simply lost his nerve. They waited. Hanssen did not recontact them. He resumed in 1985, and from 1985 onward, the operation achieved a sustained productivity that placed it, by any metric of intelligence value transferred, among the most destructive penetrations in the history of American intelligence. The technical details of what Hanssen passed during this period constitute a damage assessment that the U.S. government has never released in full. What is known from the Department of Justice's comprehensive 2002 review, from the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence report of the same year, and from Hanssen's own statements during his plea negotiations, includes the following. He identified at least 3 Soviet intelligence officers who had been recruited by the CIA and FBI, all of whom were subsequently arrested and executed by the Soviets. He revealed American signals, intelligence capabilities against Soviet communications that caused Moscow to modify its encryption practices. He disclosed details of U.S. nuclear war planning, including the location of a tunnel the FBI had dug beneath the Soviet embassy in Washington at a cost of hundreds of millions of dollars. Then he passed the complete technical specifications of the Reagan administration's Continuity of Government program, the classified system by which American government would function after a nuclear strike. And he revealed the identities of all known Soviet intelligence officers operating in the United States, the very operational knowledge that his own counterintelligence work generated. The tunnel beneath the Soviet embassy, project designated Monopoly. It, constructed at enormous expense and technical difficulty through the 1980s, was known to the KGB from the moment Hanssen's information reached Moscow. For years, American signals intelligence analysts processed the material collected from that tunnel, confident in its value, unaware that every sensitive conversation they were not hearing had been moved to other channels because the adversary knew exactly where to stop talking. That the chess game between the CIA and KGB during the Hanssen period had a quality that only became visible in retrospect. One player was moving pieces on a board from which the most important squares had been removed. American counterintelligence was working from a map of Soviet intelligence operations that Hanssen had, in essential ways, drawn himself. The black garbage bag appears for the second time here, not as object, but as method. Hanssen communicated with his handlers primarily through dead drops. Packages left at prearranged locations. Information passed through a system that required the two parties never to meet. This insistence on non-meeting was Hanssen's own requirement, imposed from the beginning and maintained with an absoluteness that his SVR handlers found both professionally admirable and personally frustrating. He understood, with the clarity of a man who had spent his career studying how Soviet intelligence operations were detected, that the moment of meeting was the moment of maximum vulnerability. He refused to be vulnerable. He also refused, throughout more than 2 decades, to give his real name. Moscow knew him as Ramon. They knew his general institutional affiliation. They did not know, despite considerable effort to determine it, who he was. This was not security paranoia. It was a calculated assessment, accurate in every particular, of how the game was played and where its decisive vulnerabilities lay. The turning point, the specific moment when the architecture of Hanssen's protection began to fracture, did not occur in Washington. It occurred in Moscow, sometime in the late 1990s, in a transaction whose exact parameters are still not fully public. By the mid-1990s, the SVR had a problem. The problem was that Ramon, their most productive American source, the man whose information had been verified consistently for nearly 2 decades, had gone quiet again. He had stopped passing material in 1991 as the Soviet Union collapsed, resumed briefly, gone quiet again. The SVR did not know if he was compromised, dead, frightened, or simply waiting. They had no way to contact him. The relationship was structured entirely on his initiative. They waited, and they protected the file with the zeal that extraordinary assets generate, and they worried. The FBI, in the same period, was running its own parallel anxiety. The damage assessments from the 1985 to 1991 period were severe enough that the FBI and CIA both understood there was a penetration they had not identified. The 1994 arrest of Aldrich Ames provided a partial explanation. Ames had indeed betrayed significant assets. But even after Ames's arrest, analysts working the damage carefully found losses that Ames could not account for. there was someone else. In 1999, the FBI authorized a significant allocation of resources to what became a formal mole hunt, designated internally as Gray Deceiver. The investigation was structured around a methodology that departed from the Bureau's traditional case-driven model. Rather than starting with a suspect, it started with the damage itself and worked backward through access records, polygraph results, financial analyses, and the statistical patterns of who had known what at the time specific assets were compromised. Then the investigation was generating a list. The list was narrowing. Robert Hanssen was on it. The decisive break came not from the investigation itself, but from a Russian source, an SVR officer, who, sometime in 2000, approached American intelligence with material for sale. The material included a file. The file was the KGB/SVR operational record of Ramon, not the complete dossier, but enough. Enough to show the shape of the operation, the timeline of the dead drops, or the nature of the material passed. Enough to reconstruct the access profile of the source, what he knew, when he knew it, which programs he had touched, and cross-reference that profile against the Gray Deceiver list. The price for this file was reportedly $7 million, paid to the Russian source. It is the single most expensive piece of intelligence the FBI has ever purchased. It is also, by the metric of what it enabled, among the most cost-effective. The file did not contain Hanssen's name. Then it contained his fingerprints, recovered from a garbage bag he had used for a dead drop, and a recording of his voice from a brief operational exchange, and enough of his access history to make the Gray Deceiver cross-reference decisive. The black garbage bag, the ordinary contractor bag chosen for its anonymity, had given him up. The fingerprints on the inside surface, left there in the ordinary act of placing material inside, were the signature he had spent 22 years refusing to give. And the FBI moved carefully from that point. They needed to verify, to build a legal case, and they needed to do it without alerting Hanssen, who remained inside the Bureau's counterintelligence apparatus, and who, this possibility haunted the investigation team, might still have enough access to detect an investigation directed at himself. He was moved to a new position in November 2000, one that gave him an FBI minder in the guise of a subordinate, and that carefully reduced his access to current operational material while giving him no reason to detect the reduction. He was watched. Now, for the first time, they knew what they were watching for. On February 18, 2001, Robert Hanssen drove to Foxstone Park in Vienna, Virginia, a quiet suburban park where he had left packages before, and placed a black garbage bag beneath a wooden footbridge over a small stream. He had been under physical surveillance since November. Every move was documented. FBI agents were positioned throughout the park. He was arrested as he walked back to his car. He said to the agent who identified himself and the situation, "What took you so long?" It was not a question. It was in the register of a man who had spent 22 years measuring himself against an institution he considered his inferior. Something closer to a verdict. The revelation that followed Hanssen's arrest on February 18th, in 2001, moved through the American intelligence and law enforcement community with the specific quality of damage that cannot be fully inventoried, because the man being inventoried had spent his career running the inventory. He knew what he had taken. He was one of the few people in a position to understand the complete dimensions of the loss, and his plea agreement required his full cooperation with the damage assessment precisely because no one else could provide it with equivalent accuracy. In the formal damage assessment, conducted jointly by the FBI and CIA, and released in summary form as the Department of Justice Office of the Inspector General report in August 2003, ran to more than 600 pages in its classified form. The unclassified summary identified broad categories of damage: human assets exposed and killed, technical collection programs compromised, nuclear war, planning details passed, signals intelligence capabilities revealed. The full classified version has not been released. It is unlikely to be released in any foreseeable time frame because the technical details it contains about American intelligence capabilities, even capabilities since modified or discontinued, represent a map of the infrastructure that the United States has spent decades building and cannot afford to have made fully public. And 3 Soviet intelligence officers who had been recruited as sources by American intelligence and whose identities Hanssen passed to Moscow were arrested by the KGB and executed. Their names are Valery Martinov, Sergei Motorin, and Dmitry Polyakov. The last of these the same Polyakov whose identity Hanssen had used as his opening credential in 1979. All 3 were fathers. All 3 were dead before the 1990s. The careers that ended with Hanssen's arrest were numerous and reached several organizational levels. The director of the FBI, Louis Freeh, resigned in June 2001, 4 months after the arrest, in a departure that was not officially connected to the Hanssen case, but which occurred in the context of an institutional reckoning that the case had made unavoidable. Several senior counterintelligence officials retired or were reassigned. The specific internal reviews that followed identified, with a precision that was professionally devastating, the ways in which the FBI's culture had made Hanssen's long survival possible, the reluctance to investigate senior agents, the institutional disinclination to look inward, the over-reliance on the polygraph as a security tool. Hanssen had passed multiple polygraph examinations because he understood the instrument's limitations better than the examiners who administered it. The person arguably most consequentially vindicated by the post-arrest revelations was Brian Kelly, a CIA counterintelligence officer who had been under active investigation as a suspected mole for nearly 3 years before Hanssen's identification. The Gray Deceiver investigation had, at an early stage, fixed on Kelly as a likely candidate, and he had spent years under surveillance, subjected to repeated polygraphs, his career effectively frozen, while the actual source continued operating. And the psychological and professional damage to Kelly was extensive and formally acknowledged when the FBI issued him a personal apology after Hanssen's arrest. Kelly retired from the CIA in 2002. He has spoken publicly about his experience in terms that are measured and specific, and that contain, beneath their professional composure, a damage that formal apologies cannot repair. The Senate Select Committee on Intelligence report on the Hanssen case, released in October 2002, contains a passage in its executive summary that functions as an institutional self-indictment of unusual directness. The FBI's failure to catch Hanssen for over 2 decades was a systemic failure. It was not a matter of insufficient resources or bad luck. It was a matter of institutional culture, organizational assumptions, and the absence of the very internal security practices that Robert Hanssen spent his career publicly advocating. He was the man who wrote the manual, and the manual had a gap in it, and he had put the gap there himself. The lasting impact of the Hanssen case on American intelligence and counterintelligence practice was structural in a way that the impact of most espionage cases is not. Most mole cases produce procedural reforms, tightened security clearance reviews, modified dead drop protocols, enhanced surveillance of foreign nationals with embassy access. And the Hanssen case produced something more fundamental: a forced confrontation with the question of whether the FBI was institutionally capable of performing the counterintelligence function that national security required. The answer, as developed through the post-arrest reviews and the implementation of reforms over the following decade, was not in its current form. The FBI created a new national security branch in 2005, reorganizing its intelligence functions in ways designed specifically to address the cultural and structural deficiencies the Hanssen case had exposed. The Bureau began, for the first time in its institutional history, conducting systematic internal security monitoring of its own counterintelligence personnel, the practice it had most resisted, the practice whose absence had made Hanssen's survival possible. The CIA instituted new compartmentalization protocols for human source identities, but protocols designed to limit access to agent identities on a strict need-to-know basis, even within the agency's own counterintelligence directorate. This was directly responsive to the Hanssen model. An analyst who knows the complete inventory of human sources is an analyst who can pass the complete inventory of human sources. The technical losses were addressed through programs that are, by their nature, classified. Modifications to signals intelligence capabilities, to nuclear war, planning infrastructure, to continuity of government systems that Hanssen had compromised. The tunnel beneath the Soviet embassy, Project Monopoly, was formally abandoned. The hundreds of millions of dollars it had cost produced as its primary legacy a cautionary lesson about the relationship between technical collection and human penetration. The most sophisticated technical program is only as secure as the human being who knows it exists. Robert Hanssen was sentenced on May 10, 2002, to 15 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, under a plea agreement that required his full cooperation with the damage assessment and spared him the death penalty. He was sent to ADX Florence, the federal supermax facility in Colorado, where he was held in near total isolation for the remainder of his life. He died on June 5, 2023, in his cell at ADX Florence. He was 79 years old. Though he had been in solitary confinement, essentially, for 22 years, the same span as his operational life as a Soviet and Russian intelligence asset. The symmetry, if one is inclined to see it, is exact. The 3 Soviet officers he burned, Martinov, Motorin, Polyakov, have no supermax cells as monuments. They have graves in Russian soil, and families who learned what happened to them years after the fact, through the slow declassification of cases that governments prefer to keep buried. Polyakov's family learned the full truth of his execution in the early 1990s, after the Soviet Union collapsed. He had been one of the most consequential intelligence assets in the history of the Cold War, a man who had chosen, at extraordinary personal risk and across 2 decades, to provide the West with information he believed would help prevent a nuclear war. He was betrayed by a man who had decided that his own grievance mattered more. The connection to modern practice is direct and unambiguous. The counterintelligence reforms implemented after Hanssen's arrest informed the American response to subsequent Russian intelligence operations, including the SVR illegal network disrupted in Ghost Stories in 2010, the institutional lessons about internal monitoring, about access limitation, about the necessity of directing investigative resources inward, became foundational doctrine. Whether the doctrine has been fully absorbed, or whether the institutional tendency toward comfortable assumption reasserts itself over time, is a question that counterintelligence professionals ask with the regularity of people who know how expensive comfortable assumptions become. ADX. Florence sits in the high desert of southern Colorado, at an elevation of 1,700 meters, surrounded by terrain that is brown and treeless and final. The facility was designed to make escape impossible, and to make the very concept of escape, over time, unthinkable. Its inmates are held in cells for 23 hours a day. The 1 hour of outdoor time takes place in a concrete enclosure open to the sky and to nothing else. Robert Hanssen spent his last years there reading. He had converted, in the specific way of men who have done what he did and need somewhere to put it, more deeply into his Catholicism. He had regular meetings with a prison chaplain. He did not give interviews. He did not, by any account available, express regret in terms that reached the public record, though the terms of his soul are not accessible to historians. In a storage facility connected to the FBI's Washington field office, there is a box of evidence from the Hanssen investigation. The box contains, among other items, a black 30-gallon contractor garbage bag, sealed in an evidence envelope, with a chain of custody tag that runs back to February 2001 and a park in suburban Virginia. On the outside of the evidence envelope, and in the standardized notation of FBI property management, is a file number and a date and the words, latent prints, positive match. The bag is ordinary. That was always the point. It was the most ordinary thing imaginable. The kind of bag available in any hardware store. chosen by a man who understood that the most dangerous hiding place is in plain sight, that the most effective disguise is normalcy itself, that an institution looking for the extraordinary will consistently fail to see the ordinary thing in front of it. He polished his shoes every morning. He went to Mass. He advocated loudly and sincerely for better counterintelligence practices within the organization he was systematically destroying. The bag sits in its evidence envelope. The fingerprints on its inner surface are the only signature Robert Hanssen left in 22 years, the only moment when the ordinary thing betrayed the man who trusted it. The question that the FBI's own retrospective reviews have never fully answered, because it resists the language of institutional reports, is not procedural. It is this: in a building full of people trained to detect deception, surrounded by the most sophisticated counterintelligence apparatus in the world, what does it mean that the most damaging spy in American history spent his career at the center of that apparatus and was seen, every day for decades, by people who were paid to see? What does it mean to look at something every day and not see it? The concrete sky above ADX. Florence is the same color as a March morning in Alexandria, Virginia. The oak trees on North Courthouse Road have leafed out and gone bare, and leafed out again 23 times since the morning the postal truck that wasn't a postal truck sat in the parking lot. The bag is in its box. The prints are on the bag. The question remains open.